5:47 a.m., September 14th, 1942. The Barrikady gun factory, northern Stalingrad. Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov pressed his back against the shattered concrete of what had been a worker's canteen, feeling the pre-dawn cold seep through his tattered greatcoat. His hands trembled, not from fear, though fear was there, cold and heavy in his stomach, but from the systematic shaking that came after 3 days without sleep and 4 without a proper meal. Around him in the darkness, 3,200 condemned men waited to die. The smell was what he would remember later, assuming there was a later. Cordite and brick dust, human waste and gangrene, the sweet, sick odor of bodies that had been rotting in no man's land for weeks. Someone nearby was praying in Ukrainian. Another man wept quietly, steadily, the sound of a machine that couldn't stop. Volkov checked his Tokarev pistol for the 7th time, though he knew it was loaded. The pistol wasn't for Germans. It was for any man in his company who tried to run. Across 400 meters of cratered wasteland, the Germans waited in the fortified ruins of Factory Workshop Number 7. Volkov could see their position clearly now as dawn broke over the Volga behind him, concrete pillboxes reinforced with steel railway ties, interlocking fields of fire, MG-42 machine guns positioned to turn the approach into a killing ground. Mathematics written in iron and bullets. He had studied the German defenses for 2 hours through borrowed binoculars. He had counted firing positions, estimated fields of fire, calculated approach vectors. Then he had burned his notes because the attack plan made all of it irrelevant. There would be no maneuver, no tactical sophistication. Just 3,200 men walking toward machine guns until either the Germans ran out of ammunition or the Red Army ran out of men. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion wasn't really a guards unit. The designation was bitter mockery. They were Shtrafniki, punishment soldiers, deserters given a chance to redeem themselves in blood, petty criminals whose sentences could be commuted by death, political prisoners whose only crime was saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, and men like Volkov himself, officers who had committed the unforgivable sin of surviving when their units were destroyed. Every man here wore the same uniform, carried the same rifle, faced the same equation. Advance until you die or retreat and be shot by your own side. Redemption through blood was the only way out, and redemption required a German bullet, not a Soviet one. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as gripping as I am telling it, please subscribe. This kind of deep historical storytelling takes serious research, and your support keeps these untold stories coming. The Soviet offensive across Stalingrad's industrial district had stalled in early September 1942, and Stalin's patience had evaporated along with it. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus controlled most of the city. The industrial complexes along the Volga's western bank, the Barrikady gun factory, the Red October steel plant, the Dzerzhinsky tractor works, had become fortresses where every workshop was a bunker, every warehouse a strong point, every assembly line a trench system. The Germans had transformed factories designed to build Soviet tanks and guns into elaborate defensive positions designed to kill Soviet soldiers. The strategic mathematics were brutal and simple. If the Red Army lost Stalingrad, the Germans would control the Volga River, severing the crucial supply route that fed the Soviet war machine. The Caucasus oil fields, already threatened, would be indefensible. The psychological impact of losing the city that bore Stalin's name would reverberate across the Soviet Union and might crack morale that was already fracturing. Stalin had issued Order Number 227 in July. Not one step back. Retreat without orders meant execution. Losing ground meant death. Every meter of Stalingrad had become worth any price in blood. But the cost was becoming unsustainable, even by Soviet standards. The 62nd Army defending Stalingrad was being bled white. Reinforcement divisions arrived across the Volga with 10,000 men and were combat ineffective within 48 hours. German artillery and air power dominated the approaches. Supplies arrived at night in small boats that were often sunk before reaching the western bank. The Red Army was running out of trained infantry, so they had begun feeding Shtrafniki into the meat grinder. Expendable men whose deaths wouldn't deplete the reliable units. Workshop Number 7 of the Barrikady factory represented a German salient that jutted into Soviet-held territory, a concrete fist that anchored the German defensive line. The workshop had been a locomotive assembly building before the war, with reinforced floors designed to support 50-ton engines and walls built to withstand industrial machinery. The Germans had reinforced these already formidable structures with steel, sandbags, and interlocking fire positions. Intelligence reported that Kampfgruppe Richthofen, elements of the 24th Panzer Division supported by attached infantry, held the position with approximately 340 men, 8 heavy machine guns, 4 mortars, and plentiful ammunition. The Soviet plan, if it could be called a plan, was to assault Workshop Number 7 frontally across open ground with no preparatory artillery barrage. Ammunition was too scarce to waste on softening positions that would have to be taken by infantry regardless. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion would attack at dawn, when German sentries might be tired and Soviet troops could use the rising sun at their backs. Success was defined as reaching German trenches and holding any ground gained. Casualties were irrelevant. The Shtrafniki were already dead men by Soviet legal definition. Their deaths would simply be formalized. Volkov had been a captain in the 157th Rifle Division before Kharkov. His entire battalion had been encircled and destroyed in the German summer offensive, and he had escaped with 43 men by breaking through German lines at night. Rather than being decorated for saving what he could, he had been arrested for unauthorized withdrawal in the face of the enemy. The fact that his orders had been to hold a position that was already behind German lines was irrelevant. He had retreated without permission. Order 227 was absolute. 3 months in a punishment battalion would cleanse his record, assuming he survived 3 months. He hadn't expected to survive 3 days. At 5:52 a.m., political officer Captain Yuri Karpov moved down the line of waiting men, his voice carrying clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. Karpov was NKVD, not Red Army, and his job was to ensure that fear of Soviet bullets exceeded fear of German ones. Comrades, in moments, you will have the honor of serving the motherland. Those who advance bravely will redeem their crimes and restore their honor. Those who hesitate will be shot. Those who retreat will be shot. There is no disgrace in dying for the Soviet Union, only in failing to die bravely. The men received this speech in silence. Most had heard variants of it before. Some had heard it yesterday when they assaulted a different German position and lost 400 men, gaining nothing. The survivors were formed into new companies and given new objectives. The Red Army's use of penal battalions had become systematic by September 1942. Throw them at German positions until something broke, then send in the reliable troops to exploit whatever gaps appeared. The Shtrafniki were bullets made of flesh, expendable ammunition in human form. Volkov checked his watch, a German chronometer taken from a dead officer at Kharkov. 5:55 a.m., 5 minutes. He looked at the men of his company, what remained of it. Most were between 20 and 30 years old. Some were hardened criminals who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Others were frightened boys who had been arrested for telling a joke about Stalin and now faced German machine guns as punishment for laughter. The diversity of crimes was matched only by the uniformity of their fate. Private Alexei Belov knelt beside Volkov, his Mosin Nagant rifle held with white-knuckled intensity. Belov was 19, a former schoolteacher from Kursk who had been arrested for defeatist statements. He had told his students that German aircraft were superior to Soviet ones, which was objectively true but politically unforgivable. 3 months ago, he had been teaching children literature. Now he was loading 5 rounds into a rifle whose barrel was worn smooth and whose accuracy was questionable beyond 100 meters. He would have to cross 400 meters of open ground before that accuracy mattered. Do we really have to just walk into it, Lieutenant? Belov's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew the answer. Volkov wanted to lie, to offer some tactical hope, some possibility of maneuver or cover. But lies wouldn't help Belov in 4 minutes, and the truth was simpler. We advance until we reach them, or until we're dead. Those are the only 2 options. The NKVD blocking detachments are behind us with machine guns. Anyone who runs goes down first. They're going to kill us all. Most of us, Volkov corrected. One will reach the German trenches. Some will survive the close combat. Maybe 100 make it through. Your job is to be one of the 100. Sergeant Pyotr Gorov, a former Red Army regular who had been caught stealing rations and given the choice between execution and penal service, spat into the dust. Mathematics of meat, he said quietly. They're spending us like bullets. Probably costs less to replace us than to replace the ammunition for a proper barrage. He wasn't wrong. The economic calculation was grotesque but accurate. A penal soldier cost the Red Army nothing. No training investment, no equipment beyond a rifle and a uniform, no pension obligations. Artillery shells required factory production, raw materials, transportation logistics. In the brutal arithmetic of total war, it was cheaper to spend condemned men than conserved ammunition. The Red Army had millions of men. It had limited shells. At 5:58 a.m., whistles began shrilling down the line. Officers and sergeants rose from cover, pistols drawn. The NKVD blocking detachment, positioned 50 meters behind the assault line, readied their Degtyaryov machine guns. These weapons weren't aimed at Germans. They were aimed at the backs of Soviet soldiers, ready to cut down anyone who retreated. The blocking detachment's orders were explicit and simple. No one goes backward. Every man either dies going forward or dies trying to go back. Mathematics of meat, indeed. Volkov stood, feeling his legs protest. He was 34 years old and felt 60. His body was a catalog of near misses, shrapnel scars on his left arm, a bayonet wound across his ribs from hand-to-hand combat at Kharkov, chronic dysentery from drinking Volga water, and the persistent cough that might be tuberculosis or might just be the brick dust that filled everyone's lungs in Stalingrad. None of it mattered now. In 2 minutes, he would be running toward German machine guns, and his physical condition would be irrelevant compared to German accuracy. The watch showed 6 o'clock a.m., exactly as the whistles reached their crescendo. "For the motherland! Forward!" The shout came from a dozen throats simultaneously, officers and political commissars screaming the ritual formula. Then 3,200 men stood and began walking toward their deaths. The first 50 meters were almost peaceful. The Germans held their fire, letting the Soviet formation emerge fully from cover, letting them commit to the attack. Volkov could hear boots crunching on rubble, the sound of thousands of men breathing hard, someone singing quietly, actually singing, a folk song from before the war. The September dawn was cold and clear, the air crisp. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. At 75 meters, the German machine guns opened fire. The sound was unlike anything Belov had imagined. Not the sharp crack of rifles, but a sustained ripping noise, like cloth tearing, but amplified 1,000 times and continuous. The MG-42 fired at 200 rounds per minute, which meant 20 bullets every second from each gun. There were 8 machine guns. That meant 160 bullets per second crossing the 400 meters of open ground, creating intersecting cones of fire that left no safe path forward. The first rank of advancing men simply collapsed, as if they had tripped simultaneously. Belov saw the man 3 steps ahead of him, a grizzled criminal named Sokolov, who had murdered his wife and been given the choice of a bullet or redemption, stumble and fall forward, his back suddenly red. Then the man to Belov's left went down, then the man to his right. The mathematical precision of it was almost elegant. The Germans weren't aiming at individuals. They were firing into zones, creating a wall of lead that Soviet bodies walked into like rain walking into a forest. Volkov kept moving forward, his body operating on autopilot while his mind cataloged the destruction with clinical detachment. The machine guns were positioned in pairs, creating overlapping fields of fire. One gun would fire a burst, then pause while the second gun covered the same sector. This prevented overheating and ensured continuous fire. The gunners were experienced. They were firing in short bursts of 6 to 8 rounds, conserving ammunition while maintaining sustained fire. Each burst found flesh. Each pause was measured. The Germans weren't panicking. They were conducting a mechanical slaughter with industrial efficiency. By 6:06 a.m., 6 minutes into the attack, the 13th Guards Penal Battalion had advanced 100 meters and lost 847 men. The bodies created obstacles that following waves had to climb over. Some of the wounded were still moving, crawling forward because moving backward meant the NKVD would shoot them. Others lay still, their blood darkening the pale dust of pulverized brick. The sound was overwhelming. Machine guns, rifle fire, men screaming, officers shouting, the wet thump of bullets hitting flesh, the crack of bullets hitting stone. Belov's rifle had become impossibly heavy. His lungs burned. He wanted to stop, to drop, to find cover in a shell crater that he could see 20 meters ahead. But stopping meant death. Not possibly death from German bullets, but certain death from Soviet ones. So he kept walking, one step, then another, his mind shrinking to the immediate task of placing one foot ahead of the other, while men died around him like wheat being cut. Private Nikolai Fedorov, a 22-year-old from Leningrad, who had been arrested for saying that the Soviet government should have evacuated more civilians before the German siege, made it to 150 meters before an MG-42 burst caught him across the stomach. He went down hard, his rifle clattering away. The pain was beyond description, beyond comprehension. His intestines were perforated in 7 places. He tried to scream but couldn't find air. His body was shutting down with efficient finality. He died at 6:08 a.m., having lived 22 years and covering exactly 152 meters toward the German positions. His body would remain where it fell for 6 weeks, becoming part of the landscape. At 6:12 a.m., 12 minutes into the attack, a German mortar round landed directly in the center of the advancing formation. The 81mm shell exploded with a flat, hard crack that was felt before it was heard. 19 men died instantly, torn apart by shrapnel moving at 5,000 feet per second. Another 37 were wounded badly enough that they couldn't continue forward. Some of the wounded tried to crawl back towards Soviet lines. The NKVD blocking detachment shot 14 of them before the others understood and began crawling toward the Germans instead, preferring capture to execution. Volkov had reached 200 meters, the halfway point, when he realized his company no longer existed as an organized unit. Of the 280 men who had started the attack with him, he could see perhaps 60 still moving forward. The rest were dead, wounded, or had been cut down so quickly they had simply disappeared from his field of vision. There was no formation now, no military order, just individuals stumbling forward through hell, each man alone with his terror and his fading hope that he might somehow be the one who survived. The German fire slackened slightly at 6:18 a.m. as the first machine gun barrels overheated despite the careful fire discipline. The gunners had gone through 3,000 rounds in 18 minutes, far exceeding the sustained fire rate the weapons were designed for. The barrel change took 45 seconds. In that brief window, another 120 Soviet soldiers advanced another 30 meters before the replacement barrel began firing and the killing resumed. Sergeant Gorov had somehow reached 250 meters, farther than he had expected to get. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the morning cold. His mouth tasted of copper and brick dust. He could see individual German soldiers now in their positions, young faces mostly, younger than his own 28 years, looking down the sights of their weapons with expressions of professional concentration. They weren't monsters. They were just soldiers doing their job efficiently, and their job was killing him and everyone around him. A mortar round landed 15 meters to his left, and the concussion knocked him down. His ears rang with a high, pure tone that seemed to come from inside his skull. When he tried to stand, his right leg wouldn't support his weight. He looked down and saw his calf was bleeding heavily. Shrapnel had torn through muscle, missing the bone by centimeters. The wound hurt less than he expected, probably shock. He tried to stand again, using his rifle as a crutch. Staying down meant the NKVD would shoot him for cowardice. So he stood, put his weight on his left leg, and continued forward, hopping on one leg like a grotesque parody of a child's game. By 6:20 a.m., 20 minutes into the assault, 1,647 Soviet soldiers were dead or dying. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion had advanced 275 meters across the 400-meter killing ground. They had not fired a single shot. Their orders were to conserve ammunition until reaching German trenches, where every bullet would be needed for close combat. So they had walked silently into machine gun fire for 20 minutes, absorbing bullets like sandbags, dying without fighting back, because orders were orders and the NKVD was behind them. Political officer Karpov had stayed well behind the assault line. his job being to shoot retreaters rather than to advance himself. At 6:22 a.m., he radioed his report to division headquarters. Attack proceeding as planned, estimated casualties 50%, ground gained approximately 275 meters, enemy resistance heavy, but showing signs of weakening. Recommend continuing assault with reserves. The division commander, General Major Zholudev, read the report without emotion. 50% casualties in 22 minutes was within acceptable parameters for a penal battalion assault. The numbers were better than yesterday's attack, which had achieved nothing at the cost of 63% casualties. He authorized the commitment of the reserve company, another 400 condemned men who had been held back in case the first wave broke through. They would now be fed into the assault to maintain pressure. At 6:25 a.m., Lieutenant Volkov reached 300 meters, close enough now to see details of the German positions that would have been invisible at distance. The machine gun nests were expertly constructed. Low profile, frontal armor from dismantled factory machinery, overlapping fields of fire, excellent visibility. The Germans had turned the workshop into a fortress that could only be taken by accepting horrific casualties, which was exactly what the Red Army was doing. Beside Volkov, Private Belov was still alive, which surprised them both. Belov had stopped thinking about survival somewhere around the 200-meter mark. Now he simply moved forward because his body continued to obey orders even after his mind had given up. His rifle felt like it weighed 50 kilograms. His legs moved through mud that didn't exist. The machine gun fire had become almost rhythmic, hypnotic even. Bursts of 6 rounds, pause 6 rounds, peas. The mechanical heartbeat of industrial death. Then Belov saw Sergeant Gorov go down 20 meters ahead, his chest suddenly open, his body thrown backward by the impact of multiple machine gun rounds hitting simultaneously. Gorov had time to look surprised before he died. His last thought was regret, not for the stolen rations that had sent him here, but for the soup his mother used to make on winter Sundays, the taste of it so vivid in his final second that he could almost smell it over the cordite and blood. At 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes into the attack, the mathematics had become undeniable. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion had lost 176 men killed or incapacitated. They had advanced 325 meters. Another 75 meters of open ground remained before the German trenches. The reserve company had entered the assault at 6:25 a.m. and was already being chewed apart by machine gun fire that showed no sign of slackening. In the German positions, Gefreiter Hans Müller was on his third barrel change of the morning. The MG-42 he crewed with his partner, Soldat Klaus Dieter, had fired over 4,000 rounds. Müller's hands were blistered from handling hot metal. His shoulder ached from the weapon's vibration. His ears had stopped registering individual shots. There was only a continuous roar now that filled his head and made thinking difficult. But the Russians kept coming, kept walking into the fire, and so he kept shooting. "They're insane," Dieter shouted over the machine gun fire, his voice barely audible. "Completely insane. Why don't they stop?" Müller didn't answer. He had fought on the Eastern Front since Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941. He had seen Soviet human wave attacks before, at Kiev, at Smolensk, at Rostov. The Russians spent men the way other armies spent ammunition, because they had more men than any other army on Earth, and their leadership valued territory over lives. He had stopped trying to understand it. He just kept shooting, because if he stopped, they would reach the trenches, and then the killing would become personal. At 6:37 a.m., the first Soviet soldier reached the German wire. His name was Private Ivan Kuznetsov. He was 26 years old, and he had been arrested for anti-Soviet agitation. He had suggested that Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps in 1937 to 38 had weakened Soviet military capabilities, which was true but forbidden. He had covered 400 meters under continuous fire through a miracle of chance and desperation. Now he stood at the barbed wire barrier that fronted the German trenches, 30 meters from the nearest machine gun position, and realized he had no wire cutters. The mission briefing had mentioned nothing about wire. Kuznetsov pulled at the barbed strands with his hands, feeling the metal bite into his palms. His blood made the wire slippery. Behind him, 3 more Soviet soldiers reached the barrier, the survivors of 3,200 gasping and wild-eyed, having walked through an hour of hell to reach this point. They pulled at the wire together, ripping their hands open, trying to force a gap. The German machine gun traversed slightly and fired a 5-round burst. All 4 men died where they stood, their bodies hanging in the wire like grotesque ornaments. At 6:42 a.m., Lieutenant Volkov reached the wire with 7 men from his company, all that remained of the 280 who had started the assault. His Tokarev pistol was in his hand, useless at this range. He had lost his helmet somewhere in the last 100 meters. Blood ran down his face from a scalp wound he didn't remember receiving. Everything had taken on a dreamlike quality, hyper-real and simultaneously distant. One of his men, a boy named Petrov, whose first name Volkov had never learned, produced wire cutters from his pack. Where he had gotten them, Volkov didn't know and didn't ask. Petrov began cutting through the wire with methodical care while machine gun fire cracked overhead. The others crouched in the shallow crater that provided minimal cover, waiting for the gap to open. More Soviet soldiers were reaching the wire now, small groups of survivors who had made it across the killing ground through luck and terror. Perhaps 200 men in total had reached this point. Behind them, the ground was carpeted with bodies in Red Army uniforms, 3,000 dead or dying men whose sacrifice had gained 389 meters of cratered ground. At 6:47 a.m., Petrov finished cutting a gap in the wire large enough for men to squeeze through. He stood to signal the others forward, and a German rifle shot took him in the throat. He fell backward, his hands clutching at the wound, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Volkov crawled forward and put his pistol against Petrov's temple. A mercy, because throat wounds like that took hours to kill, and those hours would be agony. He pulled the trigger. Then he moved through the wire gap, pistol raised, and fell into the German trench. The fighting that followed defied military analysis. It wasn't warfare in any conventional sense. It was a slaughterhouse where men killed each other with bayonets, entrenching tools, rifle butts, knives, bare hands, and teeth. The confined space of the trench network eliminated any tactical advantage. Combat distances shrank to arm's length. The German defenders, trained and experienced, fought with professional efficiency. The Soviet attackers, exhausted and desperate, fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were already dead. Private Belov, who had somehow survived the crossing, dropped into the trench and immediately drove his bayonet into the stomach of a German soldier who was turning to face him. The German screamed, a high, awful sound that Belov would hear in dreams for the rest of his life, assuming he survived the next 5 minutes. Belov pulled the bayonet out and the German collapsed, clutching his stomach, still screaming. Belov moved past him, deeper into the trench system, his mind no longer processing what he was seeing or doing. Volkov emptied his pistol into 2 German soldiers who appeared from around a corner, then used the empty weapon as a club, smashing it into the face of a 3rd German who came at him with a knife. The German went down and Volkov kicked him repeatedly in the head until he stopped moving. Then Volkov picked up the dead man's MP-40 submachine gun and kept moving forward, firing short bursts into anyone wearing Feldgrau. The close combat lasted 17 minutes. By 7:04 a.m., the surviving Soviet soldiers had cleared approximately 35 meters of trench network, a tiny salient in the German defenses that cost them everything to gain. German reinforcements were already moving up from deeper positions. Soviet survivors were running out of ammunition. The outcome was inevitable. At 7:08 a.m., a German counterattack force, 40 men from the reserve platoon, positioned in the workshop's basement, emerged from a communication trench and hit the Soviet salient from 3 sides. The fighting became even more brutal. Men grappling in the confined space, killing each other with whatever weapons came to hand. A German Feldwebel named Schmidt stabbed 3 Soviet soldiers with a bayonet before a 4th shot him in the face at point-blank range. The Soviet soldier who shot him was immediately killed by a stick grenade that removed his right arm and half his chest. Lieutenant Volkov, firing the last magazine from his captured MP-40, saw Belov pinned against the trench wall by a German soldier with a knife. Volkov shot the German in the back, then grabbed Belov's arm and pulled him toward the rear. "Fall back! Everyone fall back to the wire!" It wasn't a retreat. Retreats were organized withdrawals conducted under fire discipline. This was a rout, The surviving Soviet soldiers scrambling out of the trenches and running back across the killing ground they had just crossed, machine guns firing into their backs as they fled. The NKVD blocking detachment, seeing men running toward them, held their fire because the Germans were still shooting and killing fleeing Soviets was redundant. By 7:15 a.m., the assault was over. The survivors, 387 men out of 3,200 who had started the attack, collapsed into the Soviet trenches, gasping, bleeding, several dying from wounds sustained in the final minutes. Lieutenant Volkov sat with his back against a concrete wall, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Private Belov lay on the ground beside him, his eyes open but unseeing, his mind having retreated somewhere his body couldn't follow. At 7:30 a.m., a new lieutenant from division headquarters arrived to conduct the after-action assessment. He consulted his notes and asked Volkov, "Ground gained?" Volkov stared at him with dead eyes. 11 meters. 11 meters? We held a section of trench for 9 minutes, approximately 11 meters of their forward position before the counterattack pushed us out. The lieutenant made notes. And casualties? Volkov laughed, a sound without humor. Count the bodies. 3,200 men started the attack. You see how many came back? Do the subtraction yourself. The lieutenant's pencil moved across paper, calculating. That's 3,247 casualties for 11 meters gained, 295 men per meter. Approximately, Volkov said flatly, give or take a few corpses. The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. Division command considers this a successful operation. The attack fixed German forces and prevented them from reinforcing other sectors. General Zholudev has ordered the 27th Penal Battalion to conduct a similar assault tomorrow at 0600 hours against the adjacent position. Volkov turned his head slowly to look at the lieutenant. We lost 3,200 men to gain 11 meters of rubble that we couldn't hold. And this is considered successful? The motherland requires sacrifice, Lieutenant. All sacrifice in the defense of Stalingrad is meaningful, regardless of immediate tactical results. The German fascists must see that Soviet will cannot be broken, that we will spend any price necessary to hold Soviet soil. The price was 3,200 lives for 11 meters. That's not warfare, that's murder. The lieutenant's expression hardened. I suggest you remember that defeatist statements are punishable by immediate execution, Lieutenant. Your service in the Penal Battalion has not yet redeemed your earlier failures. I recommend you focus on preparing for tomorrow's operations rather than questioning orders. Volkov said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. He was too tired to argue, too numb to care. The mathematics were insane, but inarguable. The Red Army would continue feeding men into German machine guns until something broke. Either German morale, German ammunition, or Soviet manpower. Given the relative populations of the two nations, Soviet manpower would almost certainly outlast German bullets. Eventually. At 8:15 a.m., German intelligence officers in Workshop No. 7's command post compiled their casualty reports. The morning's action had cost them 89 men killed or wounded, 73 in the initial defense, 16 in the counterattack. It was the highest single-day casualties their company had sustained since arriving in Stalingrad. The company commander, Hauptmann Werner Vogel, read the reports with growing unease. 89 men for 11 meters, he said quietly. They lost. What did intelligence estimate? Over 3,000, Herr Hauptmann. Bodies are still being counted, but the minimum figure is 3,200. Vogel stared at the map of their defensive sector, not really seeing it. They spent 3,000 men to gain 11 meters that they couldn't hold. That's not rational military behavior. That's fanaticism, suggested his executive officer, Lieutenant Becker. They're not fighting to win territory. They're fighting to prove they can't be broken. Every attack like this demonstrates to their own people that Soviet will is limitless, that casualties are irrelevant, that the motherland will sacrifice everything for victory. It's working, Vogel admitted. 34 of our men have requested psychiatric evacuation. They're traumatized by what they saw, Russians walking into machine gun fire for an hour without hesitation, without breaking, just walking forward until they died or reached our wire. Hoffman said he watched men with half their face shot away still trying to crawl forward. Schmidt keeps saying they're not human, that normal men would have broken and run after the first 100 casualties. The psychological impact of the Soviet assault had been greater than the tactical impact. The German defenders had won by every measurable standard. They had inflicted catastrophic casualties, held their ground, and driven the attackers back with minimal losses. But the experience had shaken them deeply. German military doctrine assumed that rational opponents would retreat when casualties became unsustainable, that self-preservation would eventually overcome orders. The Soviets had demonstrated that this assumption was false. They would keep attacking until they were all dead, and then more would come the next day. They're not trying to break through, Vogel realized. They're trying to break us, not our defenses, our minds. They want us to see thousands of men shed and realize that they have millions more. They want us to understand that we're going to lose eventually because they can afford these losses and we can't. Becker nodded slowly. Demographic attrition. Stalin has more Russians than Hitler has Germans. Simple mathematics, given enough time and enough willingness to spend lives. The question is whether the Red Army's will outlasts our ammunition and our sanity. At 2:30 p.m. that afternoon, Soviet mortars began bombarding Workshop Number 7. Not a serious attack, just harassment fire designed to keep the Germans from resting. At 4:45 p.m., a small probing attack by regular Red Army infantry was easily repulsed. At 6:20 p.m., German artillery fired counter-battery missions against Soviet mortar positions. At 9:30 p.m., Soviet snipers began working the no-man's land, targeting German sentries. The Battle of Stalingrad was grinding forward with industrial efficiency, each side bleeding the other, thousands dying daily for meters of rubble in a destroyed city that had long since ceased to have any value except as a symbol. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion's assault on Workshop Number 7 was not unusual. It was one of dozens of similar attacks that occurred daily across the Stalingrad front. The casualty ratios were typical. The tactical results were typical. The human cost was typical. At 10:15 p.m., Lieutenant Volkov sat in a basement shelter, writing a letter he knew would never be sent. Mail from Penal Battalion soldiers was not delivered. Their families had been informed they were dead, regardless of actual status. But he wrote anyway, because putting words on paper was the only way to process what he had witnessed. Dearest Katya, he wrote, his handwriting barely legible. I am still alive, though I have no reason to be. Today I led 280 men across 400 meters of open ground into German machine guns. 7 survived. We gained 11 meters of trench that we held for 9 minutes before being driven back. Tomorrow I will do it again with different men, and the day after that with different men still, until there are no more men or no more meters to gain. The mathematics are insane but unarguable. The Germans have better training, better tactics, better positions. But we have more men than they have bullets, and Stalin has decided this is sufficient advantage. I have stopped thinking of the Shtrafniki as soldiers. They are currency, human rubles spent to purchase meters of rubble. Today's exchange rate was 295 men per meter. Tomorrow's will be similar. We do not win these attacks. We simply make the Germans pay for their victories in our blood, hoping they run out of will before we run out of men. The boy who died beside me today was named Belov. He was a school teacher arrested for telling the truth. His last words were asking if we really had to just walk into it. I told him yes. There was no kinder answer. I do not know if I will survive tomorrow's attack. Statistically, I should have died today. Every day I continue living as borrowed time, debt accumulated against mathematics that will eventually collect. When they finally kill me, please know that I loved you, that I thought of you every moment, and that I died for 11 meters of Russian soil that means nothing to anyone except the men who paid for it with their lives. Your Dmitri. He folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. If he died tomorrow, perhaps someone would find it. Probably not. Probably he would become another body in the rubble, his letter turning to pulp in the rain, his name eventually forgotten. At 5:47 a.m. on September 15, 1942, exactly 24 hours after the previous assault, Lieutenant Volkov stood in the same shattered canteen, surrounded by 2,800 new condemned men. The 27th Penal Battalion, formed from fresh Shtrafniki, trucked in overnight. Most had been in Stalingrad less than 6 hours. None knew what awaited them 400 meters away. Political officer Karpov gave the same speech. Comrades, in moments, you will have the honor of serving the motherland. Volkov checked his watch. The German chronometer that had survived yesterday's assault. 5:55 a.m. 5 minutes. He looked across the killing ground, now carpeted with bodies from yesterday's attack. The Germans had not bothered retrieving Soviet dead. Why would they? More would arrive today. Private Belov's body was still visible, 152 meters out, exactly where he had fallen. The crows had found him during the night. At 6:00 a.m., the whistles blew. For the motherland, forward! The 27th Penal Battalion stood and began walking toward workshop number 7. The German machine guns opened fire at 75 meters. The first rank collapsed. The attack continued. By 10:00 a.m., the 27th Penal Battalion had ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. They had gained 9 meters of German trench before being driven back. Casualties? 2,683 killed or wounded. Cost per meter? 198 men. Soviet command declared it another successful operation. The mathematics continued, day after day, penal battalion after penal battalion, thousands dying for meters that would be lost and retaken dozens of times before winter froze the ground solid. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion's assault became a footnote in Soviet military records. Attack number 47 in Sector North 7, casualties within acceptable parameters, tactical objectives partially achieved. The German defenders of Workshop number 7 held their position until November 11, 1942, when Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that would encircle the entire 6th Army, forced them to withdraw. They abandoned 11 meters of trench that had cost 3,247 Soviet lives to briefly capture 2 months earlier. By then, those 11 meters were indistinguishable from the surrounding ruins, just more broken concrete in a broken city. Of the 200 men who assaulted Workshop number 7 on September 14th, 387 survived the morning. Of those, 91 survived the September 15th assault. Of those, 23 were still alive when the war ended in May 1945. None ever spoke publicly about what they had witnessed. The mathematics were too obscene, the price too horrific, the waste too absolute. Lieutenant Volkov survived both assaults and was killed on October 3, 1942, leading another penal battalion attack on another German position. His body was never recovered. The letter to Katya remained in his shirt pocket, turned to pulp by his blood, unreadable and unsent. Private Belov's body remained at the 152-meter mark until January 1943, when Soviet forces finally secured that ground permanently. By then, he was simply bones and rotted cloth, one corpse among thousands that littered Stalingrad's industrial district. His family in Kursk never learned where or how he died. The Soviet government had informed them in September that he had been killed in action defending the motherland. That was sufficient. The human cost of Stalingrad would eventually reach nearly 2 million casualties on both sides, the bloodiest battle in human history. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion's assault was a microscopic fragment of that larger horror, 3,247 deaths among hundreds of thousands. But it perfectly encapsulated the Soviet approach to urban warfare. Spend lives without limit, accept any casualty ratio, advance regardless of cost, and never ever retreat. The Germans lost Stalingrad not because they were outfought tactically, but because they were bled to exhaustion by an enemy willing to pay any price in human lives. The Red Army's calculations proved correct. Stalin had more Russians than Hitler had bullets. The mathematics worked eventually. The 11 meters of trench cost 3,247 Soviet lives and 89 German lives. That's a kill ratio of 36.1 in Germany's favor. By conventional military standards, the Germans won decisively. But by February 1943, the German 6th Army had surrendered at Stalingrad, 91,000 survivors marching into Soviet captivity. Of those, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The mathematics had been insane, but they had worked. The Red Army learned to spend men like bullets, and there were always more men. The Shtrafniki died by thousands for meters of rubble, and their deaths purchased ultimate victory. That was the terrible truth of Stalingrad. The side willing to accept unlimited casualties would eventually win, regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. The 13th Guards Penal Battalion proved this theorem in blood across 400 meters of killing ground, 295 men per meter. The exchange rate of human lives for Russian soil. The mathematics of total war, where victory belongs not to the most skilled, but to whoever can endure losing longest. They called it the Great Patriotic War. The soldiers who walked into machine guns called it something else, but their voices were silent.